Hi everybody. Thank you for making it to this session. This is Chef Manu Chandra. I think all of Bangalore knows him, and I am Sonal Ved. I am a Bombay-based food writer and a lifestyle editor. And today we're going to be talking about my book, "Whose Samosa Is It Anyway?" which is on the history of Indian food. And Manu doesn't know it, but he's going to be interviewing me. So yeah, you can start.
Well, if you haven't read that book, you must. And this is not just an endorsement, but it's actually one of the most fascinating and most comprehensive accounts of Indian food history. Um, I've been reading it and utterly fascinated because it makes you rethink so much of what you perceive as being authentic or being yours inherently, or just saying that, this is what I grew up with, and realize very quickly that it's anything but. And Sonal's done an amazing job on the research. So
Thank
I'm
you,
going to
Chef.
jump right in and ask Sonal a few questions that I jotted down. Um, so tell me, Sonal, why did you choose this subject in particular?
I think as a food writer, I always felt that there was this big gap. There were books on different parts of Indian history, like you said you like Lizzie's book, which is only about the British influence on food and the history of curry and all of that. But there has never been that one comprehensive book that talks about Indian food history in chronology. It was very hard to find that chronology, but I think that's how I like to read things, and I felt that there was a gap, which is why I thought let me put all of this history that people talk about piecemeal into one book, and that's why this book.
So you traverse a very wide sort of expanse historically, right? And so I'm a student of history, and I know.
Right.
I mean, I had to study it for 3.5 years to be
Right.
able to get one degree, and you're
Yeah.
going from like 4,000 BC all the way to contemporary India.
Yeah.
That's why I said it's actually an extremely comprehensive account in a short book. Now, how did you, I mean, God's name, go around gathering information for a book that you could scrunch into just that many pages?
I think that's got. I give a lot of credit to chefs for this, because the amount of chefs I've interviewed who ramble and ramble and ramble and give me so much information, and then for me to put it into like comprehensive one quotes is, I think that was my practice. That was my playing ground. So when I started researching for this book, of course they were like, and this is because I was a journalist before I started writing this book, and I wrote about food. And when I started researching, there was a lot of information which I thought was not needed for people to know unless you're doing like a history project. If you're just somebody who wants information, those things were informative for me. So I wrote this book for me, and I wrote this book for somebody who is like a young chef who I think needs to know about Indian food history before he starts cooking European food, especially, which was so fascinating a while ago. And actually, I want to ask you a question on this. Why do you think books like this? Why do you think books like this are not a part of chef's curriculum? Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I didn't study chefing over here, but yes, I think it's essential that not only this be part of chef's curriculum, but I think it should be part of curricula in general, because I've always believed that being able to learn history through the context of real, because most kids find history very, very boring. They're like, oh my God, we have to memorize dates and stuff like that. Food becomes a great segue into being able to learn about history in so many ways. So not only do I feel that it should be part of curriculum for chefs, I think it should be part of curriculum for everybody. And it also busts a lot of myths, and you have in that book. So yeah, I mean, answer to your question, yes, I think it should be part of curriculum. And if this is being recorded, I'm sure someone's going to put it out there if there's any
Yeah,
educationists.
I think so.
So again, just picking on the history part again, what was the biggest challenges for you in being able to um, talk about history? And you do, I mean, you touch upon a lot of very sensitive subjects as well in this book. So what was your greatest challenge in being able to sort of maneuver around some of that or addressing it head on?
I think when I wrote Tiffin, which was like the book I wrote before this, which put together 500 Indian recipes, I think I got my lessons on do's and don'ts there, saying don't talk about this, don't talk about that, because I didn't want my book to be burnt. I wanted it to reach people, and it's okay to skip a certain subject, because I have not reached, as an author myself, I have not reached a place where, or this country unfortunately doesn't allow you to write and say and get away with everything, right? So I try to tiptoe a little bit. I try to avoid certain things, but I was trying to be as honest as possible with this book. Some of the, and I feel with a history book, as I was writing this book, new information kept coming in and kept coming in. So like even today, I can say that this is still an evolutionary process. This book is not it on Indian food history, because when I read books which were written by other people like K.T. Achaya, there's so much that has changed, new research that has come in, and the same is going to happen with this book.
No, I don't think you have to tiptoe around a lot of the subjects. I mean, a lot of them are very polarizing, of course, but
Yeah.
I think you've been able to address them from a fairly accurate historical lens. So
Thank you.
yeah,
And I think what helped is Manu to kind of have so much of fact checking, double fact checking, referencing. That's why the bibliography is like this big, and I try to reference as much as I can, so that to basically to stay as objective as possible and say, here's where I read it, and this is why I think this is the most factual fact here.
Okay, so let's just move on to some of the really interesting anecdotal stuff you've put in here. So this one was fascinating for me. It's called macaroniul.
Patata. Yeah.
Macaroniul batata. I wasn't aware of this. And what it basically does is, this whole subject, it touches upon the confluences of cuisine that define our plates and palates today. I've always maintained that food is, you cannot club cuisine or food as authentic, because it is a constantly evolving process.
Is it important to you as a chef? Is the word even relevant to you?
Authentic?
Yeah.
No, I do not like it at all.
Yeah.
I think it's rather overhyped, because what is authentic? Is it generational? Is it based in a time in history? Because everything changes, constantly is. Yeah. And the macaroniul is a classic example of that. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little about macaroniul and what that means? And what does authenticity mean to you?
Do you promise to cook it in Cannes next year?
Yeah, sure.
Will you?
We'll add it to the menu.
You did khandvi, so you can do macaroniul patata next year.
We did dhokla also.
There you go. So basically, macaroniul patata is a Sindhi dish that I actually ate in one of my classmates' dabba. It was very fascinating because it's literally elbow macaroni. It's a Sindhi dish. It's elbow macaroni, which is cooked with like a lot of spices and onion, tomato, and then like instead of paneer, you just add like a whole bunch of boiled pasta. And I was like, but then your first instinct, but this is not sabji, or this is not Indian food. Then why are we eating it with roti, right? And then I realized that it's a proper 10-15, like it's like at least. Okay, I'm losing my. He's definitely more sounding better than me. So yeah, basically it's a Sindhi dish which has macaroni cooked like a sabji. Instead of paneer, there is macaroni, and you eat it with roti. And this is just one example of how many varieties of Indian pasta that we have, right? North India has so many. Ladakh has so many varieties of pasta, which are very identical to looking like Italian pasta. And yeah, this is one example of that. It's a Sindhi dish, and I think Sindhis were one of those people who were, I can't, it's too much.
Background music. Can you guys hear?
Can you hear loud and clear? Okay.
Over that as well? Okay, that's fine. Okay, so again, picking up from another chapter, which is really fascinating, and this had me stumped actually, because I think there's been a lot of discussion around dairy cultures and cheese in India. Cheese, of course, is a subject that's very close to my heart, because I'm involved in a cheese venture as well.
Yes.
And
you can plug.
I'm not plugging anything.
Plug it.
It's okay.
Just go for it. Plug it.
Please buy Begum Victoria.
One of the nicest Indian cheeses I have ever eaten.
So, there's this theory that's always put forth that the curdling of milk was something that was considered inauspicious. And it was the Portuguese who brought that in, and essentially it's in West Bengal where this whole process started, and cheese making started from there. Yeah. And then you throw this curveball about Vedic cheese in the book, and I'm like, how? When?
So I had a very interesting conversation with this food historian based out of Bombay. His name is Kurush Dalal. And, when we were chatting about Indus Valley, apparently, now, nobody was there, right? None of us were there in this form to know whether how real it is. But apparently, dairy was a big part of Ayurveda, massive part of Ayurveda, and it was a different food group altogether. And they used to do, so there was this equipment apparently found which would hold curdled milk, and all the whey would be let out through various holes in that container. So based on that, historians believe that this could be a version of cheese, and to ferment it, they were actually interestingly using leaves. So you would curdle the milk with a certain kind of wild leaf, and then of course the whey would be let out. But again, these are just like thoughts that historians have to put this together. We don't know for sure whether cheese existed. And for me, one of the more fascinating aspects was the existence of paneer, the fact that paneer is not Indian, and it came from Central Asia, from this tribe, and it was called paneer kiki, which meant the skin of milk. And yeah, that was one of the most more interesting aspects for me.
Yeah, so I mean, the Portuguese still use leaves to make cheese. It's called milk thistle. And they add it instead of animal rennet, and that's really what coagulates it. So it's probably a very sound theory. From that chapter, again, I mean, I'm touching upon this, even though we kind of, didn't discuss it in any detail.
But chef, before you get to that, tell me, I want to ask you one thing. As a chef who's cooking,
she wrote the book.
No, I think it's important. I think I want to know your, and I don't get Manu Chandra in a corner like this very often. So I think I'm going to ask this question to you. As a chef who is cooking in so many contemporary restaurants, who's doing contemporary Indian food, how important is really history for you? Does it? I mean, see, you're like a BA in history and all of that. That's why history is important. But is it really? Would you like recommend history reading to your chefs?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think, like I said earlier also, I think historical context is so important. And you see very often, he's back,
Yeah.
that there's, okay, I don't want to sound disparaging over here, and I just might, so excuse me ahead of time. But you go to a lot of new restaurants, you see a lot of new chefs who haven't really been trained in any particular cuisine form, trying these wild experiments around food, which has no basis whatsoever.
Right.
And I do understand that when you're running a commercial establishment, it's very important for you to be able to put out something that's tasty, right? That's fine. But some of this is not confluence, it's just confusion. And the restaurant industry is very unforgiving at the end of the day. Statistics will prove that. Right. It's principally because they've not really been able to dive deep and even figure out where the genesis of a certain dish is from, or what goes well with it, to be able to mold a menu which makes sense overall. And I think, I mean, of course, Bangalore is very familiar with the plethora of multi-cuisine restaurants that we have, which is only growing bigger and wider, where you can walk into a space and have 17 cuisines. I mean, I guess it's a win for the customer, but I think at some level it's a loss for cuisine in general, because which perhaps is also evolutionary in some sense, right? But I do think a certain level of historical context, especially if you're putting yourself in the contemporary Indian headspace as far as food is concerned, is necessary. It makes for far better cooking and a far better experience.
And I think it'll be nice to kind of recognize that there is a place for both. There is a place for chefs only cooking pure, authentic, for the lack of better word, authentic food. And then there is space for people who are constantly experimenting. Like, for example, a Ranveer Brar doing like how to make exactly the kind of pani puri you will get on the street on his video is as relevant as probably somebody cooking, jackfruit, Goan jackfruit with sanas at, say, Farm Law, right? Both are different experiments. Like, you literally get like a cube of lamb with like an idli on the side, which is not mainstream, but I think both have their own places. And I feel sometimes we forget to respect the other side, saying that, okay, this is the cool thing to do and I'm just going to do this. And sometimes you're like, oh, but he's just making pani puri. But I think both have their own very important places in terms of taking Indian cuisine forward.
So let me ask you about, let's take another really interesting chapter in the book, is that we always talk about how, my grandmother used to speak about the corrupting influence of, Western food, and everyone's eating pizza and burgers. I mean, may they rest in peace, they had no idea what was to come in the future. What about India's influence on other parts of the world?
So I've not touched that chapter too deeply, like I shared with you. I have tried to focus on the influence of external elements on Indian food. With Indian food per se, I know little about how it influenced certain parts, especially of Southeast Asia. There's of course Indian food influence on Thai, Indian food influence on Sri Lankan food. There's a lot of influence in Burma because of the Tamil immigrants. Like for example, but the unique thing is the new cuisine that develops then, right? For example, in Burma, I saw people eating paratha with chopsticks, which was their influence from China and their influence from the Tamilians. So for me, then
a full paratha or kottu paratha or something?
No, this was like a proper paratha, which was cut with scissors into like 5 pieces, and then they were eating it with chopsticks. And then they had dosa, which had proper ragda, like chickpea inside. And it may be like yikes, like here I'll say, like you would say, this is just baseless fusion food. But this is so authentic to the Burmese Tamilians there. So those are few things I picked up, but I think others influence Indian cuisine in a much more profound way than we have. Our main contribution has been spices, and that's what we changed other people's palates through spices.
Malaysian food as well. I mean, a lot of Malaysian food is inspired by, well, not only inspired by, but a direct export from India.
Right.
So yeah, there you go. Lots of favorite Southeast Asian foods are largely influenced by Indian food. That's amazing. Okay, let me ask you a slightly deeper question, yeah, because this, as I was, he does it on cue with every question. So the Green Revolution marked a huge push in yield and production for a new nation, and understandably so, right? This was like mid-50s, 60s. But it also wiped out a lot of biodiversity, and biodiversity is something that I've been speaking about for years and saying, how do we sort of go back to that in some sense, because everything is becoming fairly ubiquitous. And there's this saying that if you go to at least I know it's been quantified in the US, that if you go to a US supermarket shelf and you see this giant display of food, all of that variety of food is literally made with only 15 ingredients, which have been used in different permutations, combinations, different color, different packaging, but that's it, 15 ingredients. Yeah. Oops, sorry, my screen locked. Yeah. So, how is it playing out with our return to the roots? And you see that with a lot of new restaurants, for example, or a lot of young chefs opening these experimental places. We've seen it across Goa. We've seen some in Bangalore, Bombay, Delhi, of course, more mature markets in some sense. So you're seeing millets making a comeback, jackfruit making a comeback, jaggery featuring very prominently in desserts, barley, of course. Are we seeing some kind of a full circle as far as food is concerned?
I think we're not seeing a full circle. I thought about this. I used to always say, like, food like fashion is cyclical and anything that we're all back to our grandma's way of eating and all of that. But I don't think it's cyclical. I think it always existed. It's just that now we're looking at it a little more seriously because suddenly the West has accepted it. It was always there. We always ate honey. We always ate barley. We always ate haldi, all of that. But it's the exotification that has now made it cool enough for me to post it on Instagram, and then suddenly I think, oh, everyone's eating it. That means it must be in trend. So it's always been there. For example, like of course, millets and something. I feel like there's so much of contribution from chefs like you who are bringing, and cookbook authors who are working on these subjects to bring these things and make them a little more, like, I don't even know how to cook certain millets and they're making it relevant. But if you look around, people were always eating it. It's not cyclical to say, but there are a lot of things that I found out while writing this book is, like, this is not a new trend. Like, for example, the concept of faux meat. When I saw that across different cuisines, different versions of faux meat, like, for example, for my book Tiffin, you gave me this recipe from Kayas Cuisine, which was take pese.
Take pese, yes.
Right?
Yeah,
which is like basically chunks of besan, poached besan, cooked in a gravy. Which
like gatte, basically.
Like gatte, which has like a dense meat-like texture. And those things always existed. And now we're kind of trying to pigeonhole everything and say, okay, Indians did this before anybody else. Like literally yesterday, there is this whole thing about Pilk, which is Pepsi milk that Pepsi is promoting. as pilk and cookies.
Disgusting.
And it's trending all over Instagram, and South Asians have been going at it saying, but we always had the concept of doodh and soda. But you never owned up to doodh and soda until Pepsi started talking about it. So I feel like the more, we need to be excited about our own cuisine, and we need to exotify it enough rather than wait for the West to kind of give it a thumbs up and then come back to it. That's what I feel.
Thumbs up and milk. It's still disgusting, huh?
It's like Coke float. But then apparently Calcutta has like this is what I heard. A lot of people from Calcutta messaged me, DM me saying, oh, but this always existed in Calcutta. We've been drinking doodh soda for a while. Pakistanis said that we've been drinking doodh soda for a while.
Just because they have it, it doesn't make it right.
You are going to be cooking all these things in Cannes next year.
Okay, so, I mean, I appreciate that answer, but at the end of the day, there is enough statistic which basically says that biodiversity took a nosedive.
Right.
Right?
Right.
The availability of product disappeared. Everything that was in the markets, so millet, let's say, for example, when we were doing the research on millets and trying to bring it back in vogue in some sense about 8-9 years ago, the government was very proactive in that. We saw that this state alone went from millet being a staple at about 62 to 65% of dietary consumption as far as grains was concerned to less than 6%. Right? In a matter of 30, 35 years. So obviously, not only is it about validation, it's also about the fact that people are consuming less of it. So my question was more about that. Do you see that this new trend of validation and putting it up on Instagram and wherever else is actually going to start pushing consumption patterns up rather than just making it cool?
But this, social media, of course, is responsible for generating a lot of interest in trendy food. But I think chefs have a massive responsibility here. The fact that I mean, it is for me.
She wrote the book.
I feel authors and chefs both have a massive responsibility here. I feel like it's very important for us to talk about how to use these things. A lot of times people don't cook these things because they don't know how to cook these things in contemporary fashion. I don't want to eat sama khichdi, but you teach me how to make like a pancake with sama, probably they'll eat it. And like what you did with the dinner that you did in Bombay, where he basically took barley, black rice, and one more ingredient and turned it into fried rice, which I thought was extremely smart, because why do I need to eat polished rice when I can eat indigenous rice in a way that is extremely delicious? So I think you're doing your bit, and I feel like if you could instill that in junior chefs, that would be your work done. And the same with a lot of these chefs out there, the leading chefs out there. I have a question here. Why did it take you so long to cook? No, I want to know. I genuinely want to know. Now with Single Thread, you've been cooking a lot of Indian food. All these years, we never associated Manu Chandra with Indian food. Why have you started cooking it?
I've always been cooking it.
You may be cooking it at home. You were not serving that food. I mean, nobody...
No, I think...
I never associated dhokla with you before Single Thread happened.
No, that's not true. I started cooking Indian food with Monkey Bar. That was about 12 years ago. So that was the first... many things. Khichdi, biryani, kebabs, there was a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, of course, it was a slightly mixed menu, but that's where we started showcasing a lot of regional Indian stuff in a contemporary space, which was a little more democratic. It had a bar license, so obviously it was buzzy as well. Right. The idea was to essentially create the first gastropub in India and up the game as far as bars was concerned. Now everything is a gastropub. Right. So that's really when I started. But my love affair with Indian food, obviously, I mean, was always around. Single Thread just gave me an opportunity to be able to do it in really interesting ways across the world. And I think it's a great place to showcase diversity as opposed to just the ubiquitous, and that's really what we're working towards.
And where does your research come from? What do you is there any cookbook, or are there any authors and chefs that you follow when it comes to Indian food?
So surprisingly or sadly, I think some of the best food writing around about the subcontinent and India in specific is not by Indian authors. So some of the best work is actually coming from the Americans and the Australians, who spent decades researching this. Lizzie Collingham is a classic example, who teaches, I think, at the University of Melbourne, if I'm not mistaken. She's a historian. She's a food historian. And her book, The Hungry Empire, is phenomenal. I mean, much like your book, it makes you rethink so much of what you always thought was inherently yours. And we're not even going into the, the Columbian exchange and stuff like that when the potatoes and everything else came in. But just the fact that so many, I mean, take China, for example, right? I mean, for China, everywhere, there's one ingredient that needs to be in the pantry, but it was made by the Swiss. So it's actually a Swiss ingredient, which has basically taken over Chinese pantries and gives that food a certain flavor. Or hing, which, of course, all of us think is inherently Indian. I think we're the largest consumers of asafoetida or hing. It doesn't even grow in this country. I think they've been trying to grow a little bit somewhere in Ladakh or whatever, and they haven't been successful. So almost all of it comes from Iran or Afghanistan or places like that. Have you asked me my questions? Can I ask you yours now? The last one. So, Kalia, which is, of course, a curry from, my culture, the caste culture, is a product of so much exchange. There's so many influences that come in. Samosa, obviously, is a direct import. It doesn't even belong to us in some sense.
Yeah.
How do you define Indian food now? And let me be that last question.
I think I just want to wrap up this session by just reading the conclusion that I had in my book. This is the conclusion of my book, so I'm not going to tell you whose samosa is it anyway, because for that you have to buy the book if you haven't already. It says, which brings me to Indian food in India. Redefining cuisine right now are modern Indian restaurants like Indian Accent Mask, Bombay Canteen, O Pedro, Zia, Avartana, to name just a handful. And now, of course, Single Thread, you weren't there, otherwise I would have mentioned it. Each restaurant here is redefining the generic understanding of Indian cuisine, and there are a few points that tie them together. These restaurants refuse to cow down to present rules of Indian cooking. While there's ample respect for roots and recipes, no experiment is high risk enough. They work with more than one cuisine, for example, Mexican, Indian, Portuguese, Goan, have deep codependent relationships with their farmers and producers with absolute transparency on where their ingredients come from and how the waste is utilized. Borrowing techniques from other cuisine and plating and seating focuses on comfort versus intimidation. This is not the first time in Indian history that diners are at this brink of a colossal shift in their attitude towards food, but this is definitely that time for my generation when we are witnessing a revision in approach. While concepts like chaat and kebab rolls would be considered lowbrow and fit for streets, fine dining has now embraced every facet of Indian cuisine in a more wholesome manner. So for me, Indian food is dropping old stories and stereotypes. It is invested in finding a new definition of itself. It is looking to rebel with a cause, guard its history, and is in constant mood for exploration. Indian cuisine is beginning to have a definitive voice.
Wow. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Sonal Ved.